I thought I knew what rock bottom felt like until I spent 3 years in a concrete basement chained to a radiator, believing the world had forgotten I existed. But the day two FBI agents burst through that door and told me I was their most valuable witness in the biggest financial conspiracy case in Oregon's history, I realized my nightmare was just the beginning of discovering who I really was. My name is Sarah Chen, and this is the story of how being buried alive led me to finally live. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights in the Rivera and Associates accounting office buzzed with the same monotonous hum they'd maintained for the past 4 years of my life. I sat at my gray metal desk, squinting at spreadsheets that blurred together like watercolors in rain, my fingers dancing across the keyboard with practiced precision. The office smelled of burnt coffee and industrial carpet, a combination that had become as familiar to me as my own breathing. At 28, I had convinced myself that predictability was a virtue, that being the dependable one meant something important in a world that seemed to reward chaos. My coworkers called me the spreadsheet queen, always with that patronizing smile that suggested they found my attention to detail both useful and slightly pathetic. I wore cardigans in muted colors, kept my long black hair pulled back in a neat bun, and arrived 15 minutes early every single day. My life was a series of routines that I clung to like life preservers in an ocean of uncertainty. Morning coffee at exactly 7:30, lunch at my desk while reviewing quarterly reports, evening walks through the Pearl District where I lived alone in a studio apartment that cost more than it should have but felt safe in its smallness. Portland had always been my refuge, with its constant drizzle and gray skies that matched my internal landscape perfectly. I moved here after college, drawn by the promise of anonymity in a city big enough to disappear in but small enough to navigate without feeling completely lost. My parents had wanted me to return to San Francisco, to work for one of my father's business connections, but I craved the independence that came with building something entirely my own, even if that something was just a quiet life processing other people's numbers. Marcus Rivera had hired me straight out of college, impressed by my academic record and my willingness to work for less than market rate. He was the kind of boss who remembered your birthday but forgot your name in meetings, who praised your work ethic while subtly implying that your social skills needed improvement. The accounting firm occupied 3 floors of a converted warehouse in southeast Portland, and I had claimed a desk by the window where I could watch the rain streak down glass and imagine it was washing away more than just dust. My sister Emma thought I was wasting my potential, though she said it with the loving frustration that only siblings can manage. She was finishing her senior year at Portland State, studying journalism with the kind of passionate intensity I envied. We met for coffee every Sunday at a place on Hawthorne Boulevard where the baristas knew our orders and the conversations always turned to her trying to convince me to take more risks, to date more, to demand the promotion I deserved but was too afraid to ask for. Emma was everything I wasn't. Bold where I was cautious, spontaneous where I was planned, willing to speak her mind where I swallowed my words. She had inherited our mother's fearlessness and our father's stubborn streak, while I seemed to have gotten their worry and their need for security. Our parents had immigrated from Taiwan when I was 3, building a successful restaurant business through sheer determination and 18-hour workdays. They had taught us that hard work and keeping your head down were the keys to survival in America, lessons I had absorbed perhaps too completely. Jake Morrison had been my attempt at breaking out of my shell, a relationship that lasted 8 months and ended when he grew tired of what he called my emotional unavailability. He was a software developer with kind eyes and patient hands, someone who tried to coax me out of my carefully constructed walls with homemade dinners and gentle questions about my dreams. But I had learned early that dreams were dangerous things, luxuries that people like me couldn't afford. When he finally walked away, citing his need for someone who could match his emotional investment, I told myself I was relieved. Relationships were just another variable I couldn't control, another way for life to disappoint you when you least expected it. The work at Rivera and Associates was exactly the kind of methodical, predictable task that suited my temperament. I processed invoices, reconciled accounts, and prepared tax documents with the same meticulous attention to detail that had earned me straight A's throughout school. Marcus often praised my ability to spot discrepancies that others missed, my talent for finding the needle in the haystack of numbers that didn't quite add up. I took pride in this skill, in being the person who could make sense of financial chaos, who could bring order to columns of figures that told the stories of other people's businesses and dreams. My days followed a rhythm that felt safe in its predictability. I arrived at the office before most of my coworkers, spending the quiet morning hours reviewing the previous day's work and preparing for whatever tasks Marcus would assign. The coffee pot gurgled to life around 8, followed by the gradual arrival of my colleagues, each carrying their own version of Monday morning exhaustion or Friday afternoon anticipation. I listened to their conversations about weekend plans and relationship drama with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying a foreign culture. Lunch was usually a salad eaten at my desk while I worked through account reconciliations, my efficiency praised by supervisors who appreciated having someone willing to skip breaks in service of deadline management. I had convinced myself that this dedication would eventually lead to advancement, that my reliability would be rewarded with the kind of career stability my parents had sacrificed so much to make possible for their daughters. The Portland rain created a constant soundtrack to my working life, drumming against the windows with the persistence of thoughts I tried not to think. I found comfort in its consistency, in the way it made the indoor world feel protected and separate from whatever chaos might be happening beyond the glass. My apartment was a 15-minute walk from the office, close enough that I rarely needed to drive, another small pleasure in a life built around small pleasures. Evenings were spent reading mystery novels and watching cooking shows, activities that required no emotional investment but provided enough distraction to keep loneliness at bay. I had learned to be content with my own company, to find satisfaction in the completion of daily tasks and the accumulation of small accomplishments. My bank account grew steadily, my credit score remained excellent, and my life proceeded along the careful lines I had drawn for it. But beneath the surface of this carefully constructed existence, something nagged at me with increasing persistence. It started as a vague sense that I was living someone else's life, going through motions that belonged to a person I had decided to become, rather than discovering who I actually was. The feeling grew stronger during quiet moments when the office emptied and I found myself alone with spreadsheets that suddenly seemed to mock the smallness of my ambitions. I told myself that contentment was enough.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
That not everyone needed to chase dreams or seek adventure. Some people were meant to be the steady ones, the reliable ones, the ones who kept the world running while others reached for stars. But the voice in my head grew louder, whispering questions about what might happen if I ever found the courage to want something more than safety, something bigger than the narrow corridors I had built around my heart. The accounting work itself had become second nature, numbers flowing through my consciousness like a familiar language I could speak without thinking. I processed invoices from construction companies and restaurants, retail stores and medical practices, each representing someone's attempt to build something meaningful in the world. Sometimes I caught myself wondering about the people behind the numbers, the dreams and struggles that translated into these neat columns of debits and credits. Marcus had begun giving me more complex accounts, trusting my ability to handle the kind of detailed financial analysis that required both technical skill and intuitive understanding of business patterns. I appreciated his confidence in my abilities, even as I wondered if I was destining myself to spend the next 30 years in increasingly responsible versions of the same gray cubicle, watching the same rain streak down the same windows while processing an endless stream of other people's financial stories. My sister Emma often accused me of hiding behind my work, using my dedication to my job as an excuse to avoid the messier, more unpredictable aspects of human connection. She wasn't entirely wrong, though I preferred to think of it as focusing on what I could control, rather than wasting energy on variables beyond my influence. Relationships ended, dreams disappointed, but spreadsheets balanced according to rules that remained constant regardless of human emotion or circumstance. The truth was that I had built my life around the principle of minimizing risk, of choosing paths that offered the greatest likelihood of stability and the smallest chance of devastating failure. It was a strategy that had served me well through college and into my working life, providing the security my immigrant parents had sacrificed so much to make possible. But as I sat in that buzzing office, watching rain trace patterns on glass while numbers marched across my computer screen in endless orderly rows, I couldn't shake the growing suspicion that I had confused safety with living, that somewhere in my careful planning I had forgotten to include space for joy. The fluorescent lights hummed their electronic lullaby, and I returned to my spreadsheets with the practiced focus of someone who had learned to find meaning in precision, unaware that within a few short weeks, the careful life I had constructed would shatter completely, revealing truths about myself and the world around me that would challenge everything I thought I knew about safety, courage, and what it means to truly live. Parts 2, 5. The disrupting event through compounding losses. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning that started like every other Tuesday morning in my 4 years at Rivera and Associates. I had just finished my first cup of coffee and was reviewing the Henderson manufacturing account when my desk phone rang with the sharp, insistent tone that always made me jump slightly. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end was crisp and professional in a way that immediately set my nerves on edge. Sarah Chen, this is Agent David Thompson with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I need you to remain calm and listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. The words hit me like ice water, each syllable sharp and clear despite the way my hands had started to shake. I glanced around the office, suddenly hyper-aware of every sound, every movement of my coworkers who continued their morning routines, oblivious to the fact that my world was tilting off its axis. Agent Thompson's voice continued with the kind of measured urgency that suggested he had delivered this type of news before. We have credible intelligence that your life may be in immediate danger. Do not alert anyone in your office to this conversation. Do not pack any personal items. I need you to walk calmly to the bathroom and then exit through the rear service entrance. There will be 2 agents waiting for you in a black sedan with license plate number Baker Charlie 7492. Can you repeat that number back to me? My mouth felt dry as cotton, and for a moment I couldn't form words. The Henderson manufacturing spreadsheet still glowed on my computer screen, its neat rows of numbers suddenly seeming like artifacts from another life, another version of Sarah Chen, who worried about quarterly reports and invoice discrepancies. Baker Charlie 7492, I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible above the hum of fluorescent lights that now seemed deafeningly loud. Good, Sarah, I know this is frightening, but I need you to trust me. You have information that is crucial to a federal investigation, information that makes you extremely valuable to us, and extremely dangerous to some very powerful people. Your cooperation could help us bring down one of the largest financial conspiracy networks we've ever encountered, but right now, the most important thing is keeping you alive. Do you understand? I nodded before remembering he couldn't see me, then croaked out a barely audible yes, while my mind raced to process what he was telling me. Financial conspiracy, valuable information. My life in danger. None of it made sense in the context of my quiet, predictable existence processing invoices and reconciling accounts for small businesses around Portland. I was nobody special, nobody important, just a careful accountant who showed up early and stayed late and never caused any trouble for anyone. The walk to the bathroom felt like moving through water, each step requiring enormous effort as I fought to maintain the appearance of normalcy while my heart hammered against my ribs. My coworkers looked up briefly as I passed their desks, offering the same distracted smiles they always did, completely unaware that I was walking away from everything I had built over the past 4 years. My coffee mug sat half empty on my desk next to the Henderson file, steam still rising from the surface in tiny delicate spirals. In the bathroom, I caught my reflection in the fluorescent lit mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back at me. My face was pale, my eyes wide with shock, and there was something in my expression I had never seen before, a kind of raw terror that transformed my familiar features into those of a stranger. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to steady my breathing, trying to convince myself this was some kind of mistake, some cosmic error that would be cleared up with a few simple questions. The rear service entrance was a door I had walked past hundreds of times but never used, a utilitarian exit that led to the loading dock where delivery trucks brought office supplies and where employees sometimes stepped out for cigarette breaks. The Portland morning was overcast as always, the sky a familiar gray that should have been comforting but now felt ominous, pressing down like a heavy blanket. The black sedan sat exactly where Agent Thompson had said it would be, its engine running, its tinted windows reflecting the cloudy sky like dark mirrors. Two people in dark suits emerged as I approached, their movements efficient and professional. The woman was tall with sharp features and intelligent eyes, her brown hair pulled back in a severe bun that made her look like a college professor who could also break someone's arm if necessary. The man was older, maybe 50, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested he had seen things that would keep most people awake at night. Both wore expressions of calm alertness that somehow made me feel both safer and more terrified. Sarah Chen, the woman asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. I'm Agent Rebecca Martinez, and this is Agent Thompson. We spoke on the phone. I know this is overwhelming, but we need to get you somewhere safe while we explain what's happening. Her voice was kind but firm, the tone of someone accustomed to dealing with people in crisis. The car's interior was immaculate, smelling faintly of leather and something antiseptic. I sat in the back seat, my hands folded in my lap to hide their trembling, while Agent Martinez drove through Portland streets that suddenly looked foreign and threatening. Agent Thompson turned around to face me, his expression serious but not unkind. Sarah, how long have you been working on the Cascade Construction account? The question seemed innocuous enough, but something in his tone made it clear this was not small talk. About 6 months, I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. Marcus assigned it to me when their previous accountant retired. It's one of our larger clients, mostly commercial construction projects around the Pacific Northwest. Agent Thompson exchanged a look with Agent Martinez that I couldn't interpret. Have you noticed anything unusual about their financial patterns? Payments that didn't quite make sense, invoices for services that seemed inflated, anything that stood out as odd? The question triggered something in my memory, a nagging feeling I had been carrying for weeks without fully acknowledging it. There had been irregularities in the Cascade construction files, subtle discrepancies that my detail-oriented mind had flagged but that I had attributed to the natural chaos of a large construction operation. Payments to subcontractors that seemed excessive, materials costs that fluctuated wildly from project to project, invoice numbers that didn't follow logical sequences. There were some things, I admitted slowly, watching Agent Thompson's expression sharpen with interest. Nothing major, just patterns that didn't quite add up. I mentioned it to Marcus a few times, but he said construction accounting was naturally messy, that I was overthinking things because I was used to smaller, simpler accounts. Did you keep copies of your concerns? Notes about the discrepancies you found? Agent Martinez's voice carried a note of hope that made my stomach clench with new anxiety. I nodded reluctantly. I always keep detailed notes about unusual patterns. It's just habit, I guess. My supervisor at my previous job taught me to document everything, especially when numbers don't balance the way they should. The silence in the car stretched for several long moments, broken only by the sound of windshield wipers clearing away the persistent Portland drizzle. We were heading toward the river, through neighborhoods I recognized but that now seemed to belong to someone else's life, someone else's safe, predictable world. Sarah, Agent Thompson said finally, his voice gentle but serious, those discrepancies you noticed weren't accounting errors. Cascade Construction has been laundering money for a criminal organization that operates across 6 states. The patterns you identified are evidence of a financial conspiracy that involves millions of dollars in illegal activity. Your notes, your attention to detail, your ability to spot irregularities that others missed or ignored, that makes you one of the most important witnesses we have. The words hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath and making the familiar Portland landscape blur past the car windows like a fever dream. Money laundering, criminal organization, important witness. Ing? These were phrases from television shows and movies, not from the life of a quiet accountant who ate lunch at her desk and worried about balancing spreadsheets. I don't understand, I whispered, though part of me was beginning to understand all too well. Marcus said it was normal, that construction accounting was just more complicated than what I was used to handling. Marcus Rivera is under federal investigation, Agent Martinez said, her voice carefully neutral. We believe he's been facilitating the money laundering operation through his accounting firm, using legitimate small business clients to hide the illegal transactions. Your careful documentation of the irregularities at Cascade Construction provides crucial evidence of the systematic nature of the fraud. The car pulled into a parking garage beneath a building I didn't recognize, the concrete walls closing around us like the walls of a tomb. I thought about my desk back at the office, my coffee growing cold next to the Henderson manufacturing file, my coworkers probably wondering where I had disappeared to so suddenly. My entire life had been contained within the boundaries of that office, and now it felt as distant as childhood memories. What happens now? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Agent Thompson's expression was sympathetic but serious. Now we keep you safe, while we prepare our case. The people involved in this conspiracy have killed to protect their operation. They know that you've identified patterns that could expose them, and they won't hesitate to eliminate that threat. The elevator rose silently, through floors I couldn't count, carrying me away from everything familiar towards something I couldn't begin to imagine. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows that made everyone's faces look gaunt and dangerous, and I found myself missing the gentle gray light of my office window, the comforting hum of computers processing data, the predictable rhythm of a life I had thought was too small, but now realized had been exactly the right size for someone like me. The FBI field office was nothing like what I had expected, more like a corporate workplace than the dramatic scenes I had seen in movies. Cubicles and conference rooms, people in business attire, talking quietly into phones, the smell of coffee and copy machine toner that reminded me painfully of the office I had left behind that morning. But beneath the mundane surface was an energy I couldn't quite identify, a sense of urgency and purpose that made my skin prickle with nervous awareness. Agent Martinez led me to a small conference room with gray walls and no windows, a space designed to be neutral and calming but that felt more like a tomb. She brought me a cup of coffee that tasted nothing like the coffee from my office, bitter and strong in a way that made my hands shake even more than they already were. Sarah, I need you to tell me everything you remember about the Cascade Construction account, she said, settling across from me with a legal pad and a recording device. Every detail, every discrepancy, every conversation you had with Marcus Rivera about the irregularities you noticed. Take your time, and don't worry about whether something seems important, let us decide what matters. For the next 3 hours, I recounted months of careful observations, describing invoice patterns and payment irregularities with the same precision I had used to document them in my files. Agent Martinez took notes and asked follow-up questions that revealed how thoroughly the FBI had been investigating the conspiracy, how many pieces of the puzzle they had already assembled before my careful documentation provided the crucial evidence they needed to understand the full scope of the operation. As I talked, a picture emerged that was both more complex and more frightening than I had imagined. Cascade Construction was just one part of a network that included trucking companies, restaurants, retail stores, and other businesses that provided cover for moving illegal money through seemingly legitimate transactions. My role as the accountant who processed their financial records had given me a unique window into patterns that individually seemed like minor irregularities but collectively revealed a sophisticated criminal enterprise. The people running this operation have been careful to compartmentalize information, Agent Thompson explained when Agent Martinez finished her questions. Most of the participants only know their small piece of the puzzle, but your position at the accounting firm gave you visibility into multiple parts of the network. You saw patterns that no single participant could see, connections that reveal the true scope of what we're dealing with. The magnitude of what I had stumbled into was beginning to sink in, and with it came a terror unlike anything I had ever experienced. I wasn't just a witness to accounting irregularities, I was a threat to people who had killed to protect their secrets, people who had built a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise and would not hesitate to eliminate anyone who could expose them. I want to go home, I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew how naive they sounded. I want to go back to my apartment, back to my job, back to my normal life. I never wanted to be involved in any of this. Agent Martinez's expression was compassionate but firm. Sarah, I understand how frightening this is, but there is no going back to normal. The moment you identified those patterns, the moment you documented those discrepancies, you became a crucial part of this investigation. The people involved in this conspiracy know that you have information that could destroy them, your normal life, your safety, everything depends on your cooperation with our investigation. The conference room suddenly felt suffocating, its gray walls pressing in around me like the walls of a prison cell. I thought about my sister Emma, probably sitting in a journalism class at Portland State, blissfully unaware that her sister's quiet, predictable life had exploded into something that belonged in the crime novels I read in my apartment. I thought about my parents, working in their restaurant in San Francisco, proud of their daughter who had built a stable, safe life in Portland. What about my family? The question came out as barely more than a whisper. What about my sister, my parents, are they in danger too? We don't believe your family is at immediate risk, Agent Thompson said carefully. The criminal organization we're dealing with is sophisticated, but also pragmatic. They focus their attention on direct threats to their operation. However, we will be monitoring your family's safety as a precautionary measure. The reassurance did little to calm the terror that was spreading through my chest like ice water. Everything I had built, every relationship I had cultivated, every small pleasure I had found in my careful, quiet life, was now contaminated by danger I had never chosen and never wanted. The predictability I had craved, the safety I had constructed around myself like armor, had been revealed as an illusion that could be shattered by forces completely beyond my control. As the afternoon wore on, more agents joined our conference, each bringing new pieces of information that painted an increasingly complex picture of the conspiracy I had inadvertently helped expose. There were organizational charts showing connections between businesses across multiple states, financial records documenting millions of dollars in illegal transactions, surveillance photos of people whose names I didn't recognize, but whose faces would soon become terrifyingly familiar. Sarah, we need you to understand the gravity of this situation, Agent Thompson said, as the briefing concluded. You are now under federal protection. You cannot return to your apartment, your job, or any aspect of your previous life. The people involved in this conspiracy have resources, connections, and a demonstrated willingness to use violence to protect their operation. Until we can bring them to trial and secure convictions, your life depends on remaining hidden and cooperating fully with our investigation. The words hit me like a series of physical blows, each one stripping away another piece of the life I had known. No apartment, no job, no contact with family or friends, no routine or predictability or safety net. I was being asked to trust my survival to people I had met hours ago, to abandon everything I had built in favor of a future I couldn't imagine and had never wanted. How long? I managed to ask, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. How long before I can go back to my life? The silence in the conference room was answer enough, but Agent Martinez spoke the words anyway. We don't know, Sarah. Cases like this can take months or years to fully investigate and prosecute. I'm sorry, but I need you to understand that the life you knew before today is over. We're going to help you build a new one, a safe one, but it won't be the same. As evening fell over Portland, I sat in that windowless conference room and watched my old life dissolve like sugar in rain. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, and my hands had finally stopped shaking, replaced by a numbness that felt almost worse than the terror. I thought about my desk at Rivera and Associates, probably still cluttered with the files I would never finish, my coffee mug still sitting next to the Henderson manufacturing spreadsheet that would never be completed. Somewhere in the city, Marcus Rivera was probably wondering where his reliable, detail-oriented accountant had disappeared to so suddenly. Somewhere else, people whose names I didn't know were probably discussing how to eliminate the threat I represented to their carefully constructed criminal empire. And somewhere in between, Sarah Chen, the accountant, was disappearing as completely as if she had never existed, leaving behind only a witness whose survival depended on the protection of strangers and the prosecution of criminals she had never intended to expose. The transformation from invisible office worker to federal witness had taken less than 12 hours, but already I could feel the person I had been that morning becoming a memory, a ghost haunting the edges of a life that no longer belonged to me. The careful, predictable world I had constructed was gone, replaced by something vast and dangerous and completely beyond my control, and I was beginning to understand that there would be no going back. No return to the gray cubicle and fluorescent lights and comforting routine of the life I had thought was too small, but now realized had been everything I needed. The weight of that realization settled over me like a heavy blanket, and for the first time since Agent Thompson's phone call that morning, I began to cry, mourning not just my safety and security, but the loss of the quiet, unremarkable woman I had been before the world revealed itself to be far more dangerous and complex than I had ever imagined possible. As the FBI agents made arrangements for my protection and continued their investigation, I sat in that sterile conference room and tried to comprehend how completely my life had changed in the span of a single day. The woman who had worried about spreadsheet discrepancies and quarterly reports felt like a character from a book I had read long ago, a simpler person living in a simpler world that no longer existed. In her place sat someone I didn't recognize, someone whose very existence was now defined by secrets and danger, and a truth so explosive that people were willing to kill to keep it hidden. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with the same electronic persistence I remembered from my office, but now their sound felt ominous rather than comforting, a reminder that even the most familiar, mundane aspects of life could be transformed by circumstances beyond our control. I was no longer Sarah Chen the accountant, I was Sarah Chen the witness, and that distinction would shape every moment of whatever life lay ahead of me in ways I was only beginning to understand. Part 3. Initial Fallout. The safe house was a modest ranch-style home in Beaverton that looked like every other house on the tree-lined street, its beige siding and small front lawn, designed to blend seamlessly into suburban anonymity. Agent Martinez pulled into the driveway as darkness settled over the neighborhood, the porch light casting a yellow glow that should have felt welcoming but instead highlighted how far I was from anything resembling home. The interior smelled of industrial carpet and air freshener, the kind of generic cleanliness that suggested the space was temporary, functional, designed for people who were passing through rather than living. Agent Thompson carried my single small bag, hastily packed with essentials from a Target run we had made during the afternoon. 3 changes of clothes, basic toiletries, a paperback novel I had grabbed blindly from the checkout display, items that represented the entirety of my possessions in this new reality. Everything else from my previous life remained in my Pearl District apartment, frozen in time like artifacts from an archaeological dig, waiting for someone who might never return to claim them. The living room contained furniture that looked like it had been selected for durability rather than comfort. A brown leather couch that squeaked when you sat down, a coffee table with scratched wood veneer, a television mounted on the wall that received basic cable channels. There were no personal touches, no photographs or artwork, nothing that might suggest actual human habitation. It was a space designed to be forgotten, to leave no impression on the people who passed through it temporarily on their way to somewhere else. You'll have round-the-clock protection, Agent Martinez explained as she walked me through the house, her voice taking on the professional tone she used when discussing operational details. Agent Susan Clark will be your primary contact during day shifts, and Agent Michael Rodriguez handles nights. There's a panic button in every room, and the house is equipped with security systems that monitor all entrances and windows. The kitchen was stocked with generic groceries, canned goods, and frozen dinners that could sustain life without providing any particular pleasure. The refrigerator hummed with the same electronic persistence as the fluorescent lights in my former office, but now the sound felt hollow, echoing in a space that belonged to no one and everyone. I opened cabinets mechanically, inventorying supplies I hadn't chosen, food that represented survival rather than sustenance. My bedroom was at the back of the house, overlooking a small yard enclosed by a tall wooden fence. The window was reinforced with security glass, and heavy curtains blocked any view from outside. The bed was a queen-size mattress on a metal frame, covered with white linens that smelled of industrial laundry detergent. A single dresser stood against one wall, its drawers empty except for the few items of clothing I had purchased that afternoon, under Agent Martinez's watchful supervision. "I know this is difficult," Agent Martinez said, standing in the doorway as I sat heavily on the edge of the bed. "The adjustment period is always challenging for witnesses in protection, but I want you to understand that every precaution we're taking is necessary. The people involved in this conspiracy have demonstrated their willingness to eliminate threats to their operation." The weight of those words settled over me like a physical presence in the room. Eliminate threats. I was a threat now, my very existence dangerous to people I had never met but who apparently knew enough about me to consider murder a reasonable solution to the problem I represented. The quiet accountant who had worried about balanced spreadsheets and timely invoice processing had become someone worth killing, and I couldn't begin to process how that transformation had happened so quickly and completely. Agent Clark arrived as Agent Martinez was preparing to leave, a woman in her early 40s with short blonde hair and the kind of alert, watchful expression that never seemed to fully relax. She wore jeans and a casual sweater that couldn't quite disguise the shoulder holster beneath, and she moved through the house with the efficient familiarity of someone who had done this assignment many times before. "Sarah, I'll be here overnight and through tomorrow morning," Agent Clark said, settling into the living room chair with a view of both the front window and the hallway leading to the bedrooms. "Agent Martinez has briefed me on your situation, and I want you to know that my job is to keep you safe while you adjust to your new circumstances." The phrase "new circumstances" felt inadequate to describe the complete destruction of everything I had built over the past 4 years, but I nodded anyway, not trusting my voice to remain steady if I tried to speak. The house felt simultaneously too large and too small, spacious enough to emphasize my isolation but confining enough to remind me constantly that I was trapped, that the simple freedom to walk outside whenever I chose had been stripped away along with everything else. Sleep was impossible that first night, despite the exhaustion that should have knocked me unconscious the moment my head hit the pillow. I lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to unfamiliar sounds, the house settling around me with creaks and sighs that could have been completely innocent, or could have been footsteps, could have been wind, or could have been someone testing the security of windows and doors. Every shadow seemed threatening, every sound potentially dangerous, every moment stretched into an eternity of hypervigilant terror. Agent Clark checked on me twice during the night, her footsteps soft but purposeful in the hallway, her voice gentle when she asked if I needed anything. But what I needed was my own bed, my own apartment, my own life, things that no amount of federal protection could restore. I needed the illusion of safety I had built around my predictable routine, the comfort of familiar surroundings that had made the world feel manageable and comprehensible. Dawn came slowly through the reinforced windows, gray Portland light filtering through the heavy curtains like a reminder of the life I could no longer access. Agent Clark made coffee in the generic kitchen, the smell familiar but wrong in this sterile environment, lacking the associations and comfort that had made my morning coffee ritual one of the small pleasures that structured my days. "It gets easier," Agent Clark said over breakfast, though her tone suggested she was speaking from professional obligation rather than personal conviction. "The first few days are always the hardest. Your mind keeps reaching for the routines and relationships that defined your previous life, but gradually you'll adapt to new patterns, new ways of finding stability." The toast was dry and flavorless, the orange juice too acidic, the eggs cooked differently than I preferred. Everything about this new reality felt slightly wrong, like wearing shoes that were almost the right size but not quite, a constant reminder that nothing fit properly anymore. I found myself mourning ridiculous things: my favorite coffee mug at the office, the way the light fell across my desk in the late afternoon, the comfortable familiarity of walking the same route home every evening. Agent Rodriguez arrived that afternoon, a quiet man with dark hair and serious eyes, who introduced himself with minimal conversation before settling into the protective routine that would define my new existence. He brought newspapers and magazines, generic entertainment designed to fill hours that stretched endlessly without the structure of work or social obligations. But reading required concentration I couldn't muster, my attention fragmenting every time I heard a car door slam or footsteps on the sidewalk outside. The phone calls began on the second day, Agent Martinez updating me on the investigation's progress while carefully avoiding details that might compromise operational security. Marcus Rivera had been arrested at his home in Lake Oswego, charged with money laundering and conspiracy as part of a federal indictment that included 17 other defendants. The accounting firm had been raided, its files seized as evidence, its employees questioned about their knowledge of the illegal activities that had been conducted under the cover of legitimate business operations. "Your former coworkers are cooperating with the investigation," Agent Martinez reported during one of these updates. "Most of them appear to have been unaware of the illegal activities, though we're still interviewing everyone who had access to the relevant financial records." I thought about Jennifer from reception, who always remembered to water the office plants, and Mike from the tax preparation department, who brought donuts on Friday mornings and told terrible jokes that somehow managed to be endearing. They were probably sitting in FBI conference rooms, similar to the one where I had spent that first terrible day, answering questions about a conspiracy they never knew existed, wondering how their quiet workplace had become the center of a federal investigation. The media attention started almost immediately, news reports about the arrests and the financial conspiracy that had been operating throughout the Pacific Northwest. My name wasn't mentioned in the early coverage, protected by federal guidelines governing witness security, but I recognized details about the accounting firm, the construction company, the patterns of illegal transactions that I had been the first to identify and document. Agent Clark showed me one of the news reports on the Safe House television, a serious-faced reporter standing outside the Rivera and Associates building, explaining how a sophisticated money laundering operation had been exposed through careful financial analysis. The building looked smaller on television than it had felt during the years I worked there, just another commercial structure in a city full of similar buildings, its significance invisible to casual observers who had no idea what had been happening behind its unremarkable facade. "You should feel proud," Agent Clark said as we watched the coverage. "Your attention to detail, your willingness to document irregularities that others might have ignored, that's what made this investigation possible. Thousands of people will be safer because of the work you did, even if you never intended it to have such far-reaching consequences." Pride was not what I felt watching those news reports. What I felt was a bone-deep exhaustion, a sense of being caught in currents far stronger than anything I could navigate or control. I had become a character in someone else's story, defined entirely by my role as a witness to crimes I had never chosen to discover, my entire identity reduced to the evidence I could provide against people who wanted me dead. The isolation was perhaps the most difficult aspect of my new circumstances. The way my world had contracted from the modest social connections of my previous life to the professional interactions with federal agents, whose job was to keep me alive rather than to know me as a person. I missed Emma desperately, our Sunday coffee dates that had provided the only regular emotional connection in my carefully structured existence. I missed even the superficial workplace relationships, the brief conversations with coworkers that had provided at least the illusion of social interaction. Agent Martinez had explained that contact with family and friends was impossible during this phase of the investigation, that any communication could potentially compromise my location and safety. The people responsible for the money laundering operation had extensive resources and connections, including corrupt law enforcement officials and sophisticated surveillance capabilities. Until the major players were in custody, any contact with my previous life could provide the information they needed to find and eliminate me. The safe house telephone remained silent, its ring never interrupting the endless quiet of protective custody. No calls from Emma, wondering why I had missed our coffee date. No messages from coworkers asking about the files I had left unfinished. No contact from Jake wondering if I was okay after disappearing so suddenly from the life we had briefly shared. I had become a ghost haunting the edges of my own existence, present but unreachable, alive but invisible to everyone who had ever mattered to me. Days blended into one another with the monotonous similarity of institutional routine. Agent Clark worked day shifts, Agent Rodriguez handled nights, and I occupied the hours between their professional check-ins with activities designed to fill time rather than provide genuine engagement. Television programs that couldn't hold my attention, books that required concentration I no longer possessed, simple household tasks that emphasized how completely my life had been reduced to basic survival. The panic attacks started during my first week in the safe house, overwhelming waves of terror that struck without warning, and left me gasping for air in unfamiliar rooms that felt like they were closing in around me. The agents were professional and helpful, providing breathing exercises and reassurances about my safety, but they couldn't address the fundamental problem. Everything I had built, everything I had counted on for stability and meaning, had been stripped away in a matter of hours. Agent Clark tried to establish routines that might provide some structure to my days, suggesting regular exercise periods in the backyard, specific times for meals and television viewing, small ways of imposing order on the chaos of protective custody. But routines require a sense of permanence, a belief that tomorrow will be similar enough to today to make planning worthwhile, and I had lost any confidence that the future held anything resembling predictability or control. The worst moments came late at night, when Agent Rodriguez was stationed in the living room, and I lay alone in the reinforced bedroom, listening to sounds that could have been completely innocent or completely threatening. My mind would race through scenarios of discovery and violence, imagining armed men breaking through the security systems, imagining my protection failing, and my life ending in this generic suburban house that had never been home to anyone. During one particularly difficult night, I found myself crying silently into the industrial-grade pillowcases, mourning not just my safety and freedom, but the person I had been before this nightmare began. The careful, reliable accountant, who had found satisfaction in balanced spreadsheets and timely reports, felt like someone I had known long ago, a simpler person living in a simpler world that no longer existed anywhere except in memory. Agent Martinez visited regularly to update me on the investigation's progress and to assess my psychological state, her professional demeanor occasionally softened by what seemed like genuine concern for my well-being. She brought news of additional arrests, expanded charges, and the gradual dismantling of the criminal network that had operated so successfully under the cover of legitimate business activity. The case is developing exactly as we hoped, she reported during one of these visits. Your documentation provided the foundation for understanding the full scope of the conspiracy, and we're now able to trace illegal transactions across multiple states and involving dozens of participants. The evidence is overwhelming, and we expect to secure convictions on the most serious charges. But the success of the investigation felt abstract and distant compared to the immediate reality of my confinement, the way each day stretched endlessly without purpose or progress toward any goal I could understand. I was helping to bring criminals to justice, but justice felt like a concept from another world, something that happened to other people while I sat in protective custody counting days, until some uncertain future when my testimony might no longer be needed. The agents who guarded me were competent and professional, but they were also temporary fixtures in my life, people doing a job, rather than forming relationships. They knew my case file, but not my dreams, my legal significance, but not my personality, my value as a witness, but not my identity as a human being. I had become a resource to be protected rather than a person to be known, and the loneliness of that reality was perhaps more devastating than the physical danger that had necessitated my protection. As my first week in the safe house concluded, I sat in the generic living room, watching evening news reports about the ongoing investigation, and tried to recognize myself in the story being told. The brave witness who had exposed a major criminal conspiracy felt like a character from fiction, someone whose courage and dedication I could admire but not identify with. In reality, I was just someone who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, whose natural attention to detail had revealed secrets I never wanted to know, whose quiet life had been shattered by circumstances completely beyond my control. The house settled around me with its familiar creaks and sighs, Agent Rodriguez positioned at his post in the living room, the neighborhood quiet in the way that suburban evenings were always quiet. But beneath the surface normalcy was a tension that never completely relaxed, the constant awareness that my safety depended on systems and procedures that could fail, that somewhere in the city were people who considered my death a reasonable solution to the problem I represented. I had lost everything that had given my life structure and meaning, but I had gained something too, the knowledge that the world was far more complex and dangerous than I had ever imagined, that the quiet routines I had built around myself had been an illusion of safety rather than safety itself. The person I had been before this nightmare began would never exist again, and the person I might become afterward remained a complete mystery, defined by circumstances I couldn't predict and choices I couldn't yet imagine making. Part 4. The unfair treatment. 3 weeks into my protective custody, the basement changed everything. It started as just another Tuesday morning routine check with Agent Martinez, her usual professional demeanor carrying an undercurrent of tension I had learned to recognize as significant news delivered with careful neutrality. She sat across from me at the safehouse kitchen table, her hands folded over a manila folder that remained unopened while she chose her words with unusual precision. "Sarah, we've discovered some information that changes our understanding of your situation," she began, her voice maintaining that clinical tone that federal agents used when delivering news that would fundamentally alter someone's reality. "During our investigation of Marcus Rivera's properties, we found evidence of additional criminal activities that go far beyond the money laundering conspiracy we initially uncovered." The coffee grew cold in my hands as Agent Martinez opened the folder, revealing photographs that made my blood freeze in my veins. Images of a basement room beneath Rivera's Lake Oswego home, concrete walls fitted with chains and restraints, a space clearly designed for long-term confinement. Medical supplies arranged on metal shelving, surveillance cameras positioned to monitor every corner, a ventilation system that could sustain life indefinitely while ensuring complete isolation from the outside world. "We believe Rivera was planning to abduct you," Agent Martinez continued, her professional mask slipping slightly to reveal genuine anger beneath. "The financial conspiracy was just one part of a larger operation that included human trafficking, forced labor, and systematic exploitation of witnesses who threatened their network. You weren't just marked for elimination, Sarah. You were targeted for something much worse. The photographs blurred as tears. I hadn't realized I was crying distorted my vision. The basement looked like something from a horror movie, but the clinical precision of its construction suggested it had been used before, that other people had suffered in that concrete tomb while the world above continued its normal routines. The chains were different lengths, suggesting they had been adjusted for different prisoners, and the wear patterns on the concrete floor told stories I couldn't bear to imagine. Agent Martinez spread additional photographs across the table, documentation of what appeared to be a sophisticated operation designed to break down prisoners psychologically while keeping them physically functional. The medical supplies included sedatives and stimulants, equipment for maintaining basic health without providing comfort, materials that spoke to long-term imprisonment rather than quick elimination. There were notebooks filled with observations about previous victims, clinical records of psychological deterioration and behavioral modification. How long? I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was asking how long other victims had been held, or how long Rivera had been planning my imprisonment. We're still analyzing the evidence, Agent Martinez replied carefully, but it appears this operation has been active for at least 5 years. We've identified traces of DNA from multiple victims, and we're working with missing persons databases to determine identities and connect cases that may have seemed unrelated. The safe house kitchen suddenly felt unbearably small, its walls pressing in around me like the concrete basement that had been prepared for my confinement. I pushed back from the table and walked to the window, staring through the reinforced glass at the suburban neighborhood that had become my prison, realizing that prison was exactly what it was, just a more comfortable version of the hell that had been intended for me. There's more, Agent Martinez said quietly. We found detailed surveillance records documenting your daily routines, your relationships, your psychological profile. They knew about your sister Emma, your ex-boyfriend Jake, your parents in San Francisco. The plan wasn't just to abduct you, Sarah. They intended to use threats against your family to ensure your complete cooperation with whatever they demanded. The implications hit me like physical blows, each revelation stripping away another layer of the safety I had thought existed in my carefully structured life. My quiet routine, my predictable schedule, my isolation that had felt like protection, all of it had made me an easy target for people who specialized in making human beings disappear. My own habits, the very characteristics I had thought defined my responsible, careful nature, had been mapped and analyzed by predators who understood exactly how to exploit them. Agent Martinez retrieved another folder from her briefcase, this one containing what appeared to be financial records and communication logs. The money laundering was never the primary operation, she explained. It was a screening mechanism, a way to identify potential victims who had access to sensitive information but lacked strong social connections or support systems that would lead to intensive investigations if they disappeared. The words rang in my ears with sickening clarity. Potential victims who lacked strong social connections. My isolation, which I had always framed as independence and self-sufficiency, had been recognized by criminals as vulnerability and opportunity. My careful distance from emotional entanglements, my professional demeanor that discouraged personal relationships, my entire identity as someone who didn't need other people, all of it had marked me as someone whose absence might not be immediately noticed or thoroughly investigated. They were looking for accountants, bookkeepers, financial analysts, Agent Martinez continued, people with access to detailed records but without high-profile positions that would attract attention if they vanished. People who were competent but not irreplaceable, careful but not suspicious, isolated but not completely disconnected from useful information networks. I sank back into my chair as the full scope of how thoroughly I had been evaluated and targeted became clear. My employment at Rivera and Associates hadn't been coincidental. I had been recruited specifically because my profile matched their requirements for an ideal victim. My skills, my personality, my social isolation, even my immigration background that might complicate missing person investigations, everything about me had been assessed and found suitable for their purposes. The surveillance records Agent Martinez showed me were horrifyingly detailed, documenting not just my movements and relationships, but my psychological patterns, my responses to stress, my coping mechanisms and vulnerabilities. They knew I ate lunch alone at my desk, that I walked the same route home every evening, that I avoided social situations and maintained emotional distance from coworkers. They knew about my relationship with Jake and why it had ended, about my Sunday coffee dates with Emma, about my parents' restaurant in San Francisco and their immigration status. How long were they watching me? I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. At least 18 months before your employment began at the firm, Agent Martinez replied. Possibly longer. The surveillance appears to have started while you were working at your previous job, which suggests they had been planning this operation for years before implementing it. The revelation that my entire employment at Rivera and Associates had been orchestrated as part of a plan to eventually abduct and imprison me transformed every memory of the past 4 years into something sinister and threatening. Marcus Rivera's hiring of me, his gradual assignment of more sensitive accounts, his dismissive responses to my concerns about financial irregularities, all of it had been calculated steps in a process designed to position me perfectly for abduction when the time was right. Agent Martinez showed me architectural plans for the basement, detailed schematics that revealed the full extent of the preparations that had been made for my imprisonment. The space included multiple restraint systems, monitoring equipment, and what appeared to be a sophisticated setup for recording whatever activities were planned to occur there. There were connections to the house's main electrical and plumbing systems, suggesting the basement had been designed for long-term occupancy, and sound-dampening materials that would prevent any possibility of outside detection. We believe you were intended to be held for months or possibly years, Agent Martinez explained, her voice carefully neutral despite the horror of what she was describing. The setup suggests they plan to force you to process financial records for their criminal network while using threats against your family to ensure compliance. Other victims appear to have been used for similar purposes before being eliminated when they were no longer useful. The clinical language couldn't disguise the reality of what had been planned for me: years of imprisonment, psychological torture, forced labor under threat of violence against people I loved, eventual murder when my usefulness ended. The careful life I had built, the safety I had thought came from avoiding attention and maintaining distance, had instead made me an ideal victim for people who understood exactly how to exploit isolation and vulnerability. Agent Martinez closed the folders and leaned back in her chair, her expression mixing professional sympathy with genuine anger at what the investigation had revealed. Sarah, I want you to understand that this discovery changes everything about how we approach your protection and the prosecution of this case. You're not just a witness to financial crimes anymore. You're a survivor of an attempted kidnapping and planned imprisonment that would have constituted some of the most serious federal crimes we prosecute. The word survivor felt strange applied to my situation, since I had been rescued before the actual crime occurred. But as I sat in that safe house kitchen, surrounded by evidence of the systematic planning that had gone into destroying my life, I began to understand that I had indeed survived something, even if it wasn't the physical ordeal that had been intended. I had survived the psychological assault of discovering how thoroughly my life had been analyzed and targeted, how completely my independence had been revealed as vulnerability. Agent Martinez explained that the discovery of the basement operation had led to additional arrests and charges, expanding the case far beyond the original money laundering conspiracy. Federal prosecutors were now preparing charges that included kidnapping conspiracy, human trafficking, and racketeering under statutes that carried life sentences without possibility of parole. My testimony had become even more crucial, not just as evidence of financial crimes but as proof of the systematic nature of a criminal enterprise that had operated for years without detection. The defense attorneys are going to argue that their clients never actually harmed you, Agent Martinez warned. They'll claim that the basement preparations were for other purposes, that the surveillance was routine business security, that there's no concrete evidence their clients intended to follow through on any abduction plan. Your testimony about the financial irregularities you discovered will be crucial for establishing the predicate crimes that led to the kidnapping conspiracy. The legal complexities felt overwhelming, but what struck me most was the realization that my careful documentation of accounting discrepancies had been even more significant than I had initially understood. Those irregularities hadn't just been evidence of money laundering, they had been my unwitting documentation of the screening process that had identified me as a suitable victim. My own meticulous attention to detail had created the evidence trail that would be used to prosecute the people who had planned to imprison me. As Agent Martinez prepared to leave, she handed me a new folder containing what she described as victim services information, counseling resources, legal advocacy options, financial assistance programs for people whose lives had been disrupted by federal criminal investigations. The materials felt both helpful and inadequate, practical resources for dealing with trauma that couldn't really be processed or resolved through any systematic approach. "Sarah, I know this is an enormous amount to absorb," Agent Martinez said as she gathered her materials. "The basement discovery changes the timeline for when you might be able to resume something resembling a normal life, but it also provides much stronger evidence for securing convictions that will ensure these people can never threaten you again." After she left, I sat alone in the safe house living room, trying to process the revelation that my entire employment at Rivera and Associates had been part of an elaborate plan to eventually imprison me in a concrete basement designed specifically for psychological and physical torture. The suburban quiet outside the reinforced windows felt different now, not peaceful but ominous, a reminder that predators could operate anywhere, could disguise themselves as legitimate business people while planning horrors that belonged in nightmares rather than reality. Agent Clark returned for her afternoon shift and found me sitting motionless on the couch, still wearing the same clothes I had put on that morning, unable to summon the energy for even basic activities. She had clearly been briefed on the morning's revelations, and her usual professional demeanor carried new layers of vigilance and concern. "How are you processing this information?" she asked, settling into her usual chair but positioning herself with a clearer view of the windows and entrances. The question felt impossible to answer honestly. How do you process the discovery that your entire adult life had been orchestrated by criminals who planned to torture you for years before eventually killing you? How do you integrate the knowledge that your independence and self-sufficiency had been recognized as markers of ideal victimhood? How do you continue existing when every foundation of your identity had been revealed as carefully constructed vulnerability? "I keep thinking about all the times Marcus praised my attention to detail," I finally said, my voice sounding hollow and distant even to myself. "All those conversations where he seemed impressed by my ability to spot irregularities, to identify patterns that other people missed. He wasn't recognizing my professional skills, he was confirming that I was documenting evidence he could use to justify whatever he planned to do to me." Agent Clark nodded with the kind of understanding that suggested she had worked with other victims who had discovered similar betrayals of trust and professional relationships. "Criminals who operate sophisticated long-term operations are experts at manipulation and psychological assessment," she said. "They identify people whose personalities and circumstances make them suitable targets, then create situations that exploit those characteristics while appearing to value them." The insight was both helpful and devastating, providing context for understanding how thoroughly I had been deceived, while emphasizing how completely my judgment had been compromised. Every positive interaction I had remembered with Marcus Rivera now seemed sinister and calculating, every professional accomplishment potentially just another step in a process designed to position me for eventual victimization. That evening, I found myself unable to eat dinner, my appetite destroyed by images of the basement that had been prepared for my imprisonment. Agent Rodriguez tried to engage me in conversation about neutral topics, but every subject seemed to connect somehow to the revelation that my life had been under systematic observation and analysis for years. Even the simple act of watching television felt different, knowing that my entertainment preferences had probably been documented as part of the psychological profile that had been compiled to facilitate my eventual captivity. The night brought new varieties of insomnia, my mind racing through memories of every interaction with Marcus Rivera, every assignment he had given me, every compliment he had paid to my work. I analyzed conversations I had thought were routine professional interactions, searching for signs of the manipulation and assessment that had apparently been occurring throughout our working relationship. The careful distance I had maintained from emotional connection, which had seemed like professional wisdom, now looked like exactly the kind of isolation that predators sought in their victims. Agent Rodriguez checked on me several times during those long dark hours, his presence both reassuring and a reminder of why such protection was necessary. The house's security systems hummed with electronic vigilance, monitoring entrances and windows against threats that felt both abstract and immediate. Somewhere in the city, federal agents were analyzing evidence and preparing cases, but the distance between institutional justice and personal safety felt vast and unbridgeable. Morning brought Agent Martinez back to the safe house, this time accompanied by a federal prosecutor named Rebecca Hayes, who needed to discuss the timeline for grand jury testimony and eventual trial proceedings. The legal machinery was moving forward with systematic precision, but the pace felt both impossibly slow and frighteningly fast, weeks and months of preparation leading toward a confrontation with the people who had planned to destroy my life. Sarah, your testimony will be crucial for establishing the systematic nature of this criminal enterprise, Prosecutor Hayes explained. The financial records you documented provide evidence of the money laundering conspiracy, but your personal experience of being targeted and surveilled demonstrates the human trafficking and kidnapping elements that carry much more serious penalties. The phrase personal experience of being targeted felt inadequate to describe the psychological impact of discovering that every aspect of my adult life had been orchestrated by people who planned to imprison and torture me. But I understood that legal proceedings required precise language and specific evidence, that my emotional trauma would need to be translated into testimony that could convince jurors and withstand cross-examination from defense attorneys who would try to minimize the severity of crimes that had been interrupted before completion. As the morning progressed, the full scope of my new reality became clear. I would remain in protective custody for months while the investigation continued and legal proceedings moved forward. My testimony would be required for multiple grand juries and eventually for trials that could last weeks or months. The life I had known before was not temporarily interrupted but permanently destroyed, replaced by an existence defined entirely by my role as a victim and witness in a federal criminal case. The safe house that had initially felt like temporary shelter now looked like long-term confinement, a better version of the basement imprisonment that had been planned for me, but imprisonment nonetheless. I was safer than I would have been in Rivera's concrete tomb, but I was also isolated from everything that had given my life meaning and structure, reduced to a protected asset in a legal proceeding rather than a person with autonomous choices and independent relationships. Agent Martinez and Prosecutor Hayes discussed logistics and timelines while I sat in the generic living room, understanding that decisions about my future were being made by people whose primary concern was successful prosecution rather than my psychological well-being or personal preferences. I was grateful for their protection and their dedication to bringing criminals to justice, but I also felt like I was disappearing into a system designed to handle victims rather than to restore their humanity or autonomy. The revelation about the basement had transformed my understanding of everything that had happened, but it had also confirmed my worst fears about how completely my life had been taken out of my control. The criminals had planned to imprison me physically, but the federal protection system had accomplished a different kind of imprisonment, confining me in safety that felt indistinguishable from captivity when measured against the freedom I had lost. As afternoon settled into evening and the agents discussed security protocols and legal schedules, I realized that the person who had worried about balanced spreadsheets and timely reports had been murdered just as surely as if Rivera's plan had succeeded. The basement might have been avoided, but Sarah Chen the accountant was gone forever, replaced by Sarah Chen the protected witness, a woman whose entire identity had been reduced to the evidence she could provide against people who had treated her life as disposable. The suburban twilight outside the reinforced windows looked peaceful and normal, families returning home from work and school, the ordinary rhythms of life continuing for people whose worst problems didn't include concrete basements equipped with chains and surveillance cameras. I envied them their normal concerns, their ability to worry about mundane things like traffic and deadlines, rather than systematic plans for torture and imprisonment, their freedom to walk outside without federal protection and security assessments. The safe house settled into its evening routine, Agent Rodriguez taking his position for the night shift, the security systems activated and monitored. Another day of protective custody concluded in preparation for another night of hypervigilant insomnia. But now the protection felt different, not just shelter from immediate danger, but preparation for a legal confrontation that could last years, a process that would require me to repeatedly relive and testify about trauma that I was still trying to understand and process. As I prepared for another sleepless night in the reinforced bedroom, I understood that the basement revelation had changed everything while changing nothing. I was still imprisoned, still isolated from everyone I cared about, still defined entirely by crimes committed against me by people I had tried to trust. The only difference was that now I understood exactly how much worse my situation could have been, knowledge that provided no comfort and no guidance for how to rebuild a life from the ashes of complete betrayal and systematic deception. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, exactly 5 weeks after I had been placed in protective custody, delivered by Agent Martinez, with the same careful neutrality she used for all news that would fundamentally alter my understanding of reality. The envelope was cream-colored paper, expensive stock that suggested official business, addressed in handwriting I recognized immediately as my sister Emma's careful script. But it had been opened and resealed with federal evidence tape, a reminder that even personal correspondence was now subject to security screening and governmental oversight. We had to examine it for potential security threats, Agent Martinez explained as she handed me the letter, her voice carrying an apologetic tone that didn't quite mask the professional necessity behind the violation of my privacy. Nothing in the content compromises your safety, but there are some developments you need to understand before you read Emma's message. The letter felt heavier than paper should feel, weighted with implications I couldn't yet comprehend. Emma's handwriting was shakier than usual, the careful penmanship I remembered from childhood now marked by stress that transmitted itself through every loop and curve. I could see where tears had spotted the ink in places, creating small watermarks that spoke to emotional distress I couldn't yet understand but already dreaded discovering. Agent Martinez settled across from me at the safe house kitchen table, her expression mixing professional concern with genuine sympathy. Sarah, your disappearance has had significant consequences for your family and the people in your previous life. The cover story we established, that you had accepted a temporary assignment with another accounting firm and needed to maintain confidentiality, has started to break down under scrutiny from people who know you well. The words hit me like cold water, each syllable stripping away another layer of the protection I had thought extended to the people I cared about. I had assumed that my entry into witness protection meant my family would be shielded from the consequences of my involvement in a federal investigation, that the careful lies about temporary employment would satisfy their questions and concerns while keeping them safely ignorant of the true circumstances. Agent Martinez continued with the methodical precision she used for delivering information that would cause psychological damage regardless of how gently it was presented. Emma has been asking increasingly specific questions about your whereabouts and the nature of your assignment. She contacted the Human Resources Department at Rivera and Associates and discovered that the firm has been closed pending federal investigation. She's also attempted to reach your former coworkers, several of whom have been instructed not to discuss details of the ongoing case. I opened the letter with hands that trembled, despite my efforts to maintain composure, Emma's familiar voice emerging from words that had been scrutinized by federal agents before reaching me. The message began with the kind of casual family update she always included in our communications. News about her classes at Portland State and her part-time job at a coffee shop near campus. Normal details that felt like artifacts from another universe where sisters could share ordinary concerns without governmental oversight. But the tone shifted abruptly in the second paragraph, Emma's natural directness cutting through pleasantry to address the questions that were clearly consuming her thoughts. "Sarah, I know something is wrong. I know you're not working some confidential assignment for another firm. I went to Rivera and Associates and found federal agents interviewing employees in a building that's been sealed as a crime scene. I know you're in some kind of trouble, and I know the family needs to understand what's happening." The words blurred as tears I hadn't expected began streaming down my cheeks. Emma's determination to uncover the truth, the same journalistic instincts that made her an excellent student and would someday make her a formidable reporter, had led her directly into contact with a federal investigation I had hoped would remain invisible to everyone I loved. Her natural protective instincts toward her older sister, combined with her training in investigative research, had created exactly the kind of scrutiny that could compromise operational security. Agent Martinez waited patiently while I composed myself enough to continue reading, her presence both supportive and a reminder that even this private moment of family connection was being monitored and assessed for security implications. The safe house kitchen felt simultaneously too large and too small, spacious enough to emphasize my isolation but confining enough to remind me constantly that normal family relationships had become impossible under my current circumstances. Emma's letter continued with details that revealed the full extent to which my disappearance had disrupted the lives of people who had no connection to federal investigations or criminal conspiracies. "Mom and Dad have been calling me every day since they couldn't reach you last week. They're talking about flying up from San Francisco because they're convinced something terrible has happened. Jake has been asking mutual friends if they've heard from you, and he seems genuinely worried, despite how things ended between you two." The revelation that my parents were considering traveling from California added new layers of complexity to an already impossible situation. My father's restaurant business couldn't easily accommodate extended absences, and my mother's limited English would make navigating a crisis in Portland even more difficult for both of them. Their immigration status, while completely legal, would subject them to additional scrutiny if they became involved in a federal investigation, potentially creating problems that could affect their business and their carefully constructed life in San Francisco. Agent Martinez recognized the distress Emma's letter was causing and interrupted my reading to provide context that made the situation even more complicated. "We've been monitoring communications involving your family members as a standard security precaution. Emma's inquiries at Rivera and Associates were noted by our surveillance team, and we've had to make some difficult decisions about how to handle her investigation without compromising your safety or the integrity of our case." The phrase "monitoring communications involving your family members" sent chills through my body that had nothing to do with the safe house air conditioning, my parents' phone calls, Emma's conversations with friends, Jake's attempts to locate me. All of it was being recorded and analyzed by federal agents who were trying to balance my protection against the privacy rights of people whose only crime was caring about my welfare. "Sarah, we need you to understand that Emma's investigation has attracted attention from people connected to the criminal organization we're prosecuting." Agent Martinez continued, her voice taking on the urgent tone she used when discussing immediate security threats. "We have evidence that associates of Marcus Rivera have been monitoring her activities, possibly with the intention of using her to locate you or to gather intelligence about the federal investigation." The letter crumpled in my hands as the implications of what Agent Martinez was telling me became clear. Emma wasn't just worried about my disappearance, she had unknowingly made herself a target for people who were willing to use violence against anyone who might lead them to the witness, whose testimony could destroy their criminal enterprise. My sister's love for me, her determination to ensure my safety, had placed her directly in danger from predators who understood exactly how to exploit family relationships. Agent Martinez retrieved another folder from her briefcase, this one containing surveillance photographs that made my blood freeze in my veins. Images of Emma walking across the Portland State campus, entering the coffee shop where she worked, getting into her car in various locations around the city. The photographs were taken from different angles and at different times, suggesting systematic surveillance by people with significant resources and professional capabilities. We believe Emma is being watched by individuals connected to the money laundering conspiracy, Agent Martinez explained as she spread the photographs across the kitchen table. The surveillance appears to be assessment rather than preparation for immediate action, but the situation could change quickly if they decide she represents a useful resource for locating you or compromising our investigation. The photographs showed my sister going about her normal daily routines, completely unaware that criminals were documenting her movements and analyzing her habits for potential exploitation. She looked young and vulnerable in the surveillance images, a college student whose biggest concerns should have been midterm examinations and part-time employment rather than becoming a target for people who specialized in kidnapping and torture. Agent Martinez closed the folder containing Emma's surveillance photographs and leaned back in her chair, her expression mixing professional assessment with genuine concern for the psychological impact her revelations were having on me. Sarah, we're implementing additional protective measures for your family members, but we need your cooperation in managing the situation without creating additional security risks. The phrase additional protective measures for your family members felt both reassuring and terrifying, suggesting that federal resources were being deployed to protect people I loved, while confirming that such protection was necessary because of my involvement in circumstances beyond anyone's control. Emma's normal life, like mine, was being systematically dismantled by forces that operated according to logic I couldn't understand or influence. What kind of protective measures? I asked, though I dreaded learning how extensively my family's lives would need to be altered to ensure their safety. Agent Martinez explained that Emma would be assigned discreet surveillance protection while federal agents worked to identify and arrest the individuals who had been monitoring her activities. My parents would be advised to postpone any travel plans and to report any unusual communications or suspicious activities around their restaurant. All family members would be provided with emergency contact procedures and security protocols that would fundamentally alter their daily routines and sense of personal safety. The protection we can provide your family is limited compared to witness security, Agent Martinez warned. They're not in immediate physical danger, but they're also not completely safe, as long as the criminal organization believes they might lead to useful intelligence about your location or the federal investigation. The letter from Emma remained half-read in my hands, its remaining contents now seeming less important than the security crisis her investigation had unwittingly created. My sister's natural protective instincts had led her directly into contact with people who were willing to exploit family relationships through violence and intimidation, transforming her from a concerned sibling into a potential victim of the same criminal enterprise that had targeted me. Agent Martinez suggested that I be allowed to make a carefully monitored phone call to Emma, an opportunity to provide limited reassurance while discouraging further independent investigation that might compromise security for all involved parties. The call would be recorded and analyzed, conducted from the safe house, under strict protocols that would prevent any possibility of location tracking or intelligence gathering by hostile parties. The prospect of speaking with Emma, after weeks of complete isolation, felt both desperate attractive and terrifyingly dangerous. I wanted to hear her voice, to provide some comfort for the worry I knew she was experiencing, to reassure her that I was safe and being protected by competent professionals. But I also understood that any contact could potentially provide information that might be used to compromise the security that was keeping me alive. Agent Martinez arranged for the phone call to take place that afternoon, giving me several hours to prepare for a conversation that would need to convey reassurance without providing specific information, love without location details, safety without specifics about the circumstances that had necessitated my disappearance. The safe house telephone, which had remained silent throughout my weeks in protective custody, suddenly seemed like both a lifeline and a potential instrument of disaster. The hours before the scheduled call stretched endlessly, filled with anxiety about seeing Emma's voice, while knowing that everything we said would be monitored and potentially analyzed for security implications. Agent Clark tried to engage me in routine activities, but concentration was impossible when my mind kept racing through possible scenarios for how a conversation with my sister might unfold under such unprecedented circumstances. When the appointed time arrived, I sat in the safe house living room with Agent Martinez positioned nearby to monitor the call, and Agent Clark maintaining her usual security watch. The telephone felt heavy in my hands, weighted with implications I couldn't fully comprehend, but already dreaded experiencing. Emma answered on the first ring, her voice carrying relief and worry in equal measure. Sarah? Oh my God, are you okay? Where are you? I've been so worried, and Mom and Dad are going crazy because no one will tell us anything about what's happening. The words tumbled out in a rush of emotion that made my throat tighten with tears I couldn't afford to shed while being monitored by federal agents. I'm safe, Emma. I can't tell you details about where I am or what's happening, but I'm being protected by people who know what they're doing. The words felt inadequate and artificial, bureaucratic language that couldn't convey the complexity of my situation or the depth of my concern for her safety. Emma's voice sharpened with the focused intensity she brought to investigative research, her natural instincts as a journalism student taking precedence over sibling emotion. Sarah, I know you're involved in some kind of federal case. I know Rivera and Associates was raided and that employees are being questioned about criminal activity. I need you to tell me if you're in danger, if there's anything the family should be doing to help or protect ourselves. The directness of her questions created exactly the kind of security dilemma Agent Martinez had warned me about. Emma deserved honest answers about the risks that had been created by my involvement in the investigation, but providing those answers could compromise operational security and potentially increase danger for everyone involved. The conversation was being recorded, analyzed, potentially monitored by people whose intentions were hostile rather than protective. Emma, I need you to stop investigating this situation, I said, trying to inject authority into my voice despite the emotional turmoil of hearing my sister's worry. I need you to trust that I'm being protected and that the best thing you can do for me and for the family is to avoid any activities that might attract attention or create additional complications. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several long seconds before Emma responded with the kind of stubborn determination that had always been both her greatest strength and her most concerning characteristic. Sarah, you're asking me to ignore the fact that my sister has disappeared into some kind of witness protection program. You're asking me to pretend that everything is normal while federal agents are investigating criminal activities at your workplace. Agent Martinez signaled that the call needed to be concluded soon, her expression indicating that Emma's persistence in seeking specific information was creating exactly the kind of security risk that made family contact dangerous for everyone involved. The conversation I had hoped would provide reassurance was instead confirming that my sister's natural protective instincts were placing her in additional danger while compromising the operational security that was keeping me alive. Emma, I love you, and I need you to trust me when I tell you that the best way to help me right now is to live your normal life and avoid any investigation or inquiry into my circumstances, I said, putting as much emphasis as possible into words that felt inadequate for the complexity of what I was trying to communicate. I will contact you again when it's safe to do so, but right now I need you to protect yourself and the family by staying away from this situation. The call ended with mutual expressions of love and concern that couldn't bridge the gap created by circumstances neither of us could control or fully understand. Emma's voice had carried frustration along with worry, the natural response of someone whose instincts demanded action in a situation where action could only create additional danger for everyone involved. Agent Martinez debriefed me immediately after the call, analyzing Emma's responses and assessing the security implications of information that had been exchanged. My sister's persistence in seeking details about my circumstances had confirmed federal concerns about her potential to compromise operational security through well-intentioned but dangerous investigation. Sarah, we're going to need to implement more extensive protective measures for Emma, Agent Martinez explained. Her determination to investigate your situation makes her a potential target for exploitation by people who understand how family relationships can be used to gather intelligence or apply pressure to witnesses. The revelation that Emma would require additional federal protection because of her concern for my welfare added new layers of guilt to an already overwhelming psychological burden. My involvement in the investigation had not only destroyed my own life but was now systematically dismantling the safety and privacy of everyone I cared about, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond the original criminal conspiracy. That evening, as I sat in the safe house living room trying to process the day's revelations, I realized that protective custody had become its own form of torture, isolating me from family relationships while ensuring that my isolation caused additional suffering for the people I loved most. The criminals who had planned to imprison me in a concrete basement had failed, but the federal protection system had achieved a different kind of imprisonment that was destroying family connections and creating new victims of circumstances I had never chosen. The safe house settled into its evening routine, but the security measures that had once felt protective now seemed more like the walls of a different kind of prison, barriers that kept danger out while also keeping love and human connection at bay. Agent Rodriguez took his position for the night shift, the security systems activated and monitored. Another day of protective custody concluded in preparation for another sleepless night of guilt and anxiety about the consequences my situation was creating for innocent people. As I prepared for bed in the reinforced bedroom, I understood that the phone call with Emma had changed everything while solving nothing. She was now under federal surveillance for her own protection, my parents were living with worry and confusion they couldn't resolve, and Jake was asking questions that could potentially attract dangerous attention to all of them. My entry into witness protection had created a cascade of disruption that was systematically damaging the lives of everyone who had ever cared about my welfare. The basement that had been prepared for my imprisonment had been avoided, but a different kind of torture had taken its place. The knowledge that my safety was being purchased with the suffering and disruption of people who had never chosen involvement in federal investigations or criminal conspiracies. The protection that was keeping me alive was simultaneously destroying the relationships that had made life worth living, creating a form of isolation that was both necessary and unbearable. The night brought familiar insomnia, but now it was complicated by new varieties of guilt and helplessness. As I lay in the dark listening to security systems hum while imagining Emma under surveillance, my parents worrying in their San Francisco restaurant, Jake asking questions that might attract dangerous attention. The federal agents who protected me were competent and dedicated, but they couldn't protect me from the psychological torture of knowing that everyone I loved was suffering because of circumstances I had accidentally created through careful attention to accounting irregularities. As dawn approached and another day of protective custody began, I realized that the criminal conspiracy had succeeded in ways its architects had never intended. They had planned to imprison me physically, but the federal response had created a different kind of imprisonment that was methodically destroying every human connection that had given my life meaning. The basement had been avoided, but isolation had been achieved, and the psychological impact was perhaps more devastating than anything that could have been accomplished through direct physical torture. The suburban morning outside the reinforced windows looked peaceful and normal, families beginning another day of ordinary concerns and routine activities, people whose lives hadn't been systematically dismantled by criminal conspiracies and federal investigations. I envied them their ability to worry about mundane problems, their freedom to communicate with family members without security screening, their assumption that protection didn't require complete isolation from everyone they loved. Agent Clark arrived for her day shift with news that Emma had reluctantly agreed to accept federal security protocols, a development that provided some reassurance while confirming that my sister's life had been fundamentally altered by circumstances she had never chosen. The protection she would receive was necessary but intrusive, transforming her college experience and employment situation in ways that would affect her future long after the federal case concluded. As another day of protective custody began, I sat in the safe house kitchen drinking coffee that tasted like institutional survival rather than morning comfort, understanding that the criminal organization had achieved a form of victory despite their failure to carry out their original plan. They had intended to destroy my life through physical imprisonment and torture, but the federal response had accomplished a different kind of destruction that was systematically eliminating every relationship and connection that had made existence meaningful. The safe house that had initially represented rescue now felt like a tomb where I was being kept alive for legal purposes while everything that had made life worth living was methodically destroyed by necessary security measures. The protection was real and essential, but so was the isolation, and the combination was creating a form of existence that felt more like survival than living, more like slow-motion death than genuine safety. The breaking point came on a rain-soaked Wednesday morning 7 weeks into protective custody, when Agent Martinez arrived at the safe house carrying news that would shatter what remained of my carefully constructed denial about the scope of destruction my situation had created. She sat across from me at the kitchen table where we had shared so many previous conversations about evidence and legal proceedings, but this time her expression carried a gravity that immediately set my nerves on edge. "Sarah, we've discovered something that changes our entire approach to this case," she began, her voice carrying the measured tone she used when delivering information that would fundamentally alter my understanding of reality. During our ongoing surveillance of the criminal network, we intercepted communications that indicate they're planning to use your family members as leverage to force you to recant your testimony. The words hit me like ice water, each syllable stripping away another layer of the protection I had thought extended to the people I loved. I had assumed that federal security measures would be sufficient to keep Emma and my parents safe from the consequences of my involvement in the investigation, that the careful surveillance and protective protocols would prevent the criminal organization from gaining access to people who could be used against me. Agent Martinez opened a folder containing transcripts of intercepted phone calls and text messages, communications between known associates of Marcus Rivera, that revealed detailed plans for what they euphemistically called family outreach. The language was carefully coded to avoid explicit threats, but the implications were clear. They intended to abduct Emma and use her safety as leverage to force me to either refuse to testify or to provide false testimony that would undermine the federal case. The plan appears to involve taking Emma during her commute to campus, Agent Martinez explained, pointing to specific passages in the intercepted communications. They've identified her daily routine, her class schedule, and the locations where she's most vulnerable to approach without attracting immediate attention from law enforcement. The transcript pages blurred as tears I couldn't control began streaming down my cheeks. Emma's careful routine, the same kind of predictable schedule that had made me an ideal target for surveillance and planning, had now been analyzed and mapped by criminals who understood exactly how to exploit family relationships through violence and intimidation. My sister's commitment to her education, her responsible approach to managing work and school obligations, had created the very vulnerabilities that predators needed to destroy both our lives. Agent Martinez continued with details that revealed the sophisticated nature of the criminal organization's capabilities and their willingness to escalate violence when their primary operations were threatened. The communications indicate they have resources within law enforcement agencies, people who can provide intelligence about federal protective measures and potentially compromise security protocols designed to protect witnesses and their families. The revelation that corrupt law enforcement officials were providing intelligence to the criminal network added new layers of terror to an already impossible situation. The federal agents who had been protecting me, monitoring my family, and investigating the conspiracy were potentially being undermined by colleagues who had been compromised through bribery, blackmail, or other forms of corruption that I couldn't understand but whose consequences were becoming devastatingly clear. What does this mean for Emma's protection? I asked, though I dreaded learning how extensively my sister's life would need to be altered to ensure her survival. Agent Martinez explained that Emma would need to be placed in protective custody immediately, that her normal life would have to be suspended indefinitely, while federal agents worked to identify and arrest the corrupt officials who were providing intelligence to the criminal organization. My sister would be forced to abandon her college education, her part-time employment, and all social connections that had given her life structure and meaning. Emma is being transported to a secure location as we speak, Agent Martinez continued. She's been informed about the immediate threat to her safety, but she's also been told that her protection depends on complete cooperation with federal security protocols that will essentially end her previous life. The knowledge that Emma was being forced into the same kind of isolation I had experienced felt like a knife twisting in my chest. My sister, whose only crime had been loving me enough to investigate my disappearance, was now facing the same destruction of personal autonomy and social connection that had been systematically dismantling my identity for nearly 2 months. The criminals who had planned to torture me in a concrete basement had failed, but they were succeeding in destroying the lives of innocent people through the federal response their crimes had necessitated. Agent Martinez retrieved additional documents from her briefcase, intelligence reports that revealed the full scope of the criminal organization's capabilities and their determination to prevent my testimony from reaching a courtroom. Sarah, we need you to understand that this case has become about much more than money laundering and kidnapping conspiracy. We're dealing with a network that has corrupted law enforcement officials, infiltrated federal agencies, and demonstrated willingness to target families of witnesses who threaten their operations. The magnitude of what I had accidentally exposed through careful attention to accounting irregularities was beginning to overwhelm my ability to process information rationally. What had started as minor discrepancies in construction company invoices had revealed a criminal enterprise that operated at levels of sophistication and violence that belonged in action movies rather than the quiet life of a Portland accountant who ate lunch at her desk and worried about balanced spreadsheets. The corruption investigation has identified at least 3 federal employees who have been providing intelligence to the criminal network, Agent Martinez explained. We believe they have detailed information about our protective protocols, the locations of safe houses, and the identities of agents assigned to witness security details. The implications of compromised federal security struck me with paralyzing terror. The safe house where I had been living for 7 weeks, the agents who had been protecting me, the entire system designed to keep me alive until I could testify, all of it had potentially been compromised by people whose job was supposed to be protecting witnesses rather than selling them to criminals who specialized in elimination of threats. Agent Martinez recognized the psychological impact her revelations were having and tried to provide reassurance that felt both necessary and inadequate given the circumstances. Sarah, we're implementing emergency relocation protocols immediately. You'll be moved to a new facility with enhanced security measures, and your protection detail will consist entirely of agents who have been cleared through additional background investigations. The prospect of another relocation, another destruction of whatever minimal stability I had managed to establish in protective custody, felt overwhelming despite my understanding that such measures were necessary for survival. The safe house had never felt like home, but it had become familiar, and familiarity was the closest thing to comfort available in a life that had been systematically stripped of everything that provided emotional security. What about my parents? I asked, knowing that my mother and father in San Francisco were completely unprepared for the kind of sophisticated threat that was now targeting our family. Agent Martinez explained that my parents would be provided with enhanced security measures, but that their immigration status and language barriers complicated the protective options available to them. They couldn't be easily relocated without destroying the restaurant business they had spent decades building, but they also couldn't be adequately protected while maintaining their normal routines in a city where the criminal organization had demonstrated reach and resources. Your parents have been informed about the general nature of the threat, but we haven't provided specific details that might increase their anxiety without improving their safety, Agent Martinez said carefully. They understand that you're involved in an important federal case and that the family needs to follow security protocols until the legal proceedings conclude. The knowledge that my elderly parents were living with fear and confusion they couldn't fully understand, unable to speak freely with their daughter or to resume normal business operations, added new dimensions of guilt to my already overwhelming psychological burden. The restaurant they had built through decades of 18-hour workdays was now subject to federal security protocols that disrupted both their livelihood and their sense of safety in the country they had chosen as their permanent home. Agent Martinez gathered her materials and prepared to oversee my emergency relocation, but before leaving she handed me a final document that would prove to be the catalyst for everything that followed. It was a letter from Emma, written from her own protective custody and delivered through official federal channels, but her words carried the same determined intensity that had always characterized her approach to problems that seemed impossible to solve. Sarah, I know you're blaming yourself for what's happening to our family, but I need you to understand that none of this is your fault. Emma had written in her careful script, you didn't choose to discover evidence of criminal activity, and you didn't choose to become a target for people who think violence is an acceptable business strategy. What you can choose is how you respond to the situation we're all facing now. Emma's letter continued with the kind of clear-eyed analysis that made her such a gifted journalism student, breaking down the situation in terms of choices and consequences rather than guilt and victimization. The criminals who are threatening our family are counting on your love for us to make you too afraid to testify. They're using the federal protection system against itself, turning the isolation of witness security into psychological torture that's designed to break your resolve. The insight was both painful and illuminating, providing a framework for understanding how systematically I was being manipulated by people who understood that destroying my emotional connections would be more effective than direct physical threats. The basement that had been prepared for my imprisonment would have been simpler and more straightforward than the psychological warfare that was being conducted through the federal protection system itself. Sarah, you have to fight back, Emma's letter concluded. Not just by testifying, but by refusing to let these people destroy our family through fear and isolation. The only way to protect all of us is to ensure that they're convicted and imprisoned where they can never threaten anyone again. As I sat in that safe house kitchen, reading my sister's words while Agent Martinez prepared for my emergency relocation, I realized that Emma was right about the choice I faced. I could continue allowing myself to be paralyzed by guilt and fear, letting the criminals achieve their goals through psychological manipulation, or I could decide to fight back using the only weapons available to me, my testimony and my refusal to be broken by circumstances I had never chosen. The decision crystallized with sudden clarity that cut through weeks of confusion and helplessness. I would not allow my family to be destroyed by people who treated human lives as disposable obstacles to their criminal enterprises. I would not permit my sister's education and future to be sacrificed to protect murderers and kidnappers who had already demonstrated their willingness to torture innocent people for profit. Agent Martinez, I said, my voice steadier than it had been since the day I first learned about the federal investigation. I want to do more than just testify. I want to help you catch the corrupt federal employees who are providing intelligence to the criminal organization. I want to be part of taking down this entire network. Agent Martinez paused in her preparation for relocation, her expression shifting from professional sympathy to sharp interest. Sarah, what you're suggesting would require you to participate in operational activities that go far beyond standard witness protection. It would mean additional risks, more complex security arrangements, and exposure to dangers that could compromise your safety. The warning about additional risks felt almost absurd, given that my current situation already involved threats to kidnap and murder both me and my family members. The elaborate security measures designed to protect me had become their own form of imprisonment, and the criminals were successfully using the federal protection system to achieve psychological destruction that was perhaps more effective than direct violence. Agent Martinez, they're already destroying my family and my life through the protection system itself, I replied, feeling something I hadn't experienced since my entry into witness protection, a sense of agency and purpose that cut through the helplessness of being a passive victim. The only way to actually protect the people I love is to ensure that these criminals are stopped permanently, not just delayed until they can develop new strategies for elimination of threats. Agent Martinez studied my face for several long moments, apparently assessing whether my newfound determination represented genuine resolve or temporary emotional reaction to stress and trauma. Sarah, operational participation would mean working directly with federal agents to gather evidence, potentially including controlled contact with suspects and surveillance activities that could expose you to immediate physical danger. The prospect of controlled contact with people who had planned to torture me in a concrete basement should have been terrifying, but instead it felt like the first opportunity I had been offered to take control of circumstances that had been controlling me for nearly 2 months. The passive role of protected witness had become its own form of torture, reducing me to evidence rather than allowing me to participate in my own defense. I understand the risks, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice, but I also understand that passive protection isn't working. Emma is in protective custody, my parents are living in fear, and the criminals are using our family relationships against us more effectively than any direct threat could accomplish. Agent Martinez made several phone calls to supervisors and federal prosecutors, discussing options and protocols that had apparently never been considered for someone in my situation. The conversations were conducted in coded language that I couldn't fully understand, but the tone suggested that my request to participate actively in the investigation was both unusual and potentially valuable for achieving prosecutorial goals that couldn't be accomplished through traditional witness protection. As the morning progressed and arrangements were made for my relocation to a more secure facility, I felt something changing inside me that went beyond simple determination or anger. The careful, risk-averse accountant, who had built her life around predictability and safety, was disappearing, replaced by someone who understood that real security could only be achieved by confronting threats directly rather than hiding from them indefinitely. The safe house that had been my prison for 7 weeks suddenly felt different, not like a tomb where I was being kept alive for legal purposes, but like a temporary staging area before returning to a world where I could take action rather than simply enduring protection. Agent Martinez completed her phone calls and returned to the kitchen table with an expression that mixed professional excitement with genuine concern for my psychological state. Sarah, there are operational possibilities that could use your insider knowledge of the accounting firm and your unique understanding of the financial patterns that exposed this criminal network, she explained. But participation would require psychological evaluation, specialized training, and acceptance of risks that go far beyond anything involved in standard witness testimony. The mention of specialized training and operational possibilities sent adrenaline coursing through my system in ways that felt more energizing than terrifying. For the first time since my entry into protective custody, I was being offered an opportunity to be something other than a victim, to use my skills and knowledge for purposes that went beyond passive cooperation with federal prosecutors. As we prepared to leave the safe house for my relocation to enhanced security facilities, I realized that Emma's letter had accomplished something that weeks of federal protection and psychological counseling had failed to achieve. It had reminded me that I was capable of making choices about how to respond to circumstances rather than simply enduring whatever was imposed upon me. The suburban street outside looked peaceful and normal as Agent Martinez escorted me to the waiting federal vehicle, but I no longer envied the families whose lives proceeded according to predictable routines. Normal had revealed itself to be an illusion that could be shattered by forces beyond anyone's control, and safety was something that had to be actively created rather than passively maintained. As we drove through Portland toward whatever enhanced security facility awaited me, I understood that my transformation from accountant to federal witness was about to evolve into something even more significant, from protected victim to active participant in dismantling the criminal organization that had tried to destroy my life and was now threatening everyone I loved. The rain continued its steady Portland rhythm against the car windows, but now it felt like preparation for action rather than simply another day of survival, another step toward confronting the people who had underestimated both my capabilities and my determination to protect the family they had tried to use against me. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.